Hi, this is Roger Moore, and you're listening to James Bond Radio.
Hello, I have a message for you. I'm Dan Gale from Station S, Somerset, but don't hold that against me. I have the privilege of offering the listeners of James Bond Radio, that's you, an exclusive interview with a doctor. Cary Edwards PhD, lecturer and author of a new book on the Bond films of Timothy Dalton. As a film studies lecturer, Cary, in his book, goes deep into the unwritten subtext of these two films, unearthing potential hidden meanings in the symbolism and character arcs, highlighting things that, even if you've seen The Living Daylights and License to Kill 100 times, you'd probably never even considered before. It's great to see the same critical analysis usually applied by film studies textbooks to classic films like Alien or Psycho, applied to two 80s Bond films that so many mainstream audiences seem all too happy to ignore. Let's not forget that Alan Partridge's assistant Lynn referred to Dalton's movies as the Welsh ones. Cary's book is entitled He Disagreed with Something That Ate Him, and it's a short but punchy introduction into the world of how to read a film. I caught up with Cary recently over Skype, and I was happily oblivious as we spoke to the creaky desk that I was leaning on, so sorry about that in advance, but you could use it as some sort of drinking game. Have a swig of your Bud and Lime each time you hear it doing its little wooden farts in the background of the interview. See who can last the longest. I'll be back at the end of the interview with an exclusive recording of my attempt to burp the entire James Bond theme, all 1 minute 49 seconds of it, so do make sure you stay to the very end. But for now, let's have a chat with Cary Edwards. Hit me!
Who are you?
My name's Bond. James Bond.
Bond.
James.
Bond, what do you think you're doing?
Welcome to James Bond Radio. News, reviews, and discussion of all things 007.
Pussy. As you can see, I have no problem with female authority.
Oh, pipe down, 007.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
I'm joined by Dr. Cary Edwards, PhD, which means he's far more qualified to be talking about Bond than I am. So hello, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. That's really nice to be here.
Now, people might be wondering, who the hell are you and why are we talking to you? So
It's a very good question.
Why would a Bond fan be interested in you at the moment?
Well, I've written a short book. It's what we call a monograph, which is a short study of usually one film, but I've done two films, and I've done Timothy Dalton's films. And the reason I did this is being a long-term Bond fan starting in childhood, probably like yourself, and those of us who are old enough to remember the 80s, we used to go down to the video store and rent and re-rent the Bond films or watch them on TV and tape them and try and hit record and stop when the adverts were on and all those sorts of things. And as I've gone through being a Bond fan and the ups and downs of that, I've always felt that Dalton's films haven't got the credit they deserve, the attention they deserve, and they're sort of like the sort of the embarrassing stepchild of the Bond films. In fact, I was watching something the other day, and they even made a joke about Timothy Dalton being everybody's seventh favourite James Bond, and it was like, hang on a minute, I don't think like that. But you know, that's how it is, and for a lot of people, James Bond is such a broad thing, and it has such a sort of popular impact. It's a really interesting topic, but I wanted to hone down on the two films that I think don't get enough attention. I think are really good movies, and I think are a really interesting moment in this hugely, nearly 50-year franchise that's made billions of dollars of money. Cubby Broccoli used to say half the world's population have seen a Bond film, and yet sometimes the Dalton films still get, I think, kicked about a bit. And I quote in the book a recent list in The Guardian, and I can't remember the author's name, but he puts them down at the bottom. And it's just something I keep seeing.
Yes, we're going to get to that a little later on, because I'm amazed you managed to include that in your book. It was so recent.
It was a last minute addition. It was just one of those things. As soon as I saw it, you've got to throw those things in. So for me, I fell in love with the Dalton films. It coincided with my adolescence, which, they're a bit moody. I was getting a bit moody. when I've revisited them as an adult, I still think they're really solid movies. I think they're very interesting in what they do to the franchise, and I also think that they preempt a lot of the current Daniel Craig changes. But when Timothy Dalton did them, these were bad things. Now Daniel Craig does them, everybody loves it, and that I find a really interesting disparity.
Absolutely, yes, it's funny how people forget. I mean, if they did that with Batman, you know, which was constantly fluctuating between being outrageous and then dark and moody, and then George Clooney does it and it's very silly again, and then Christopher Nolan does it and it's very dark again, and now you've got multiple. You've got cartoon series, you've got comics, you've got graphic novels, all these different things, and they're all juggling in the air at any one time. You can have any kind of Batman you want, but there seems to be only one Bond film, and that's it. There can't be a serious one and a silly one to keep everybody happy, and that often makes critics sort of unsure about whether something was successful or not, because they're judging it by what everyone is enjoying now.
I think it's really good. I mean, a lot of it probably comes from the first Bond you see. I think you get set. And, you know, for my parents' generation who grew up in the 60s, it was, you know, Sean Connery is James Bond and everybody else is just wearing his suit. My first experience was really with Roger Moore. And I think Octopussy was a film I watched a lot. But Spy Who Loved Me as well. And, you know, I really enjoyed. And for me, when the Dalton films happened, there was quite a shock. A good shock. But particularly License to Kill. Living Daylights is kind of like, has one foot full Dalton, but you feel these hangovers from the Moore films slightly. I know they cut some bits out. There's a scene I think they cut out or shot where he's on a magic carpet. And, you know, that's very Roger Moore, and they thought, okay, that doesn't quite work. But with License to Kill, you get a really different, full-fledged sort of action film version of James Bond, which I just loved it straight away. And I thought it was new and fresh. But of course, for everybody who thinks it's new and fresh, there's somebody else who goes, that's not what I grew up with, that's not what I love, that's not what I'm into. And sadly, I'm not sure it used to be like this, but I'm finding fan communities, not necessarily James Bond fan communities, but communities generally, are getting quite vociferous. I saw The Last Jedi, the Star Wars film, last year, and quite enjoyed it. But your face suggests maybe
no. I'm agreeing with you with regards to how the fans reacted to it in an over the top fashion. It was the death of cinema as far as some people were
You would have thought somebody had died.
Yeah.
You know, whereas I'm at a time when GoldenEye came out, I was just grateful there was another Bond film. You know, 6 years later, I was just didn't think, and it was just, there's more James Bond, and we live at a time when there's more James Bond now than ever. There's more novels. There's, you know, the movies, there's the comic books, which I've not read, but apparently are quite good.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's great, and that we get the choice to choose our Bonds as opposed to being sort of fixed.
Right, look, we are already getting far into this discussion, far too deep into this discussion. We don't know anything about you yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the discussion of your book on hold for a little bit, and I'm going to ask you the hilariously named Quickfire questions, which are never quickfire.
Of course.
Number one, Cary Edwards, what is your favourite Bond film?
It is probably License to Kill. However, it's quite often the one I'm watching at the time. It's easier to tell you the ones I don't like than the ones I really love. I love From Russia with Love. I think that's a fantastic film. I obviously really, really like License to Kill. Goldfinger, you know, is inescapable because it is sort of like the ultimate Bond film. It just sits there perfectly. I have a lot of love for GoldenEye as well, because that was the first film I actually got to see in the cinema. And I love those, so one of them.
All right. Well, you mentioned in your book that you came out of GoldenEye not quite sure how you felt. You were feeling a little bit... It wasn't what you were expecting, because that's exactly how I felt. I came away thinking... Well, it didn't have Timothy Dalton in it, so straight away it's hamstrung itself.
I think over the years, I've kind of mentally decided that the Bond films that I grew up with stopped with License to Kill, and then something else happened.
Yeah.
And that's not, you know, necessarily good or bad. I dislike the idea that because the pre-credit sequence of GoldenEye is set earlier, it almost feels like, oh, we're just going to ignore Timothy Dalton and pretend that didn't happen. And it just left a bad taste in my mouth. However, the action in that movie, I mean, the opening sequence of that movie is terrific, and it's just bonkers. And a lot of the action's great. I've rewatched it recently and thought, oh, it's slower than I remembered. But it's still a pretty solid movie. And I thought Brosnan was really good first time out. I actually think he's best in GoldenEye. I
watched it again for the first time in a very long time recently because James Bond Radio was covering it, and they needed reviews of it. And I thought, now is the time to rewatch it. It's been maybe 10 years or so, which is maybe quite shocking to say. But I had this love-hate relationship with the film, and watching it again, it is fantastic. It really is great, and it's far more mature. And I mean, like you, I love The Living Daylights and License to Kill. They are the two most important films in the franchise for me. But even I can see that they are very much films of the 70s and 80s. They're kind of a little slow in places. They're having all the inserts filmed in a studio.
Yes, there's some of the back projection in the cars, and you're like, oh, really?
Whereas GoldenEye would do most of that on location, and it just seems faster and fresher and far more modern. Yeah. So I appreciate it a lot more now than I used to.
When I watch GoldenEye, what gets me, though, is the things I really like are often stuff that I think are hangovers from Dalton's film. The action is very physical, is much more realistic and physical, and those things feel much more Dalton. And then as the Brosnan films go on, they move further and further away from that, and I dislike them as they get further away from GoldenEye. I can say I don't like them, but the rest of the world clearly disagrees with me. But by the time you get to Die Another Day, I was really, I was fed up. I was very fed up with Die Another Day.
It had evolved a little bit too far in a different direction.
I thought so. I thought it had sort of gone almost Roger Moore, but without the sense of fun. And it's like, I don't think you can have invisible cars without people and take the film seriously.
Just a quick question. See what I was saying, that these are not quickfire questions. So we're still on number one. We've been recording for 13 minutes. So, just quickly, out of interest, because this always fascinates me, how many times have you seen Die Another Day?
4 or 5. It is the one. It's the one I've watched the least. I mean, I watched it in the cinemas, and I was like, oh God. And then I watched it on DVD because you kind of want to revisit and think, was I in a bad mood? Was I being harsh? And then I caught it a couple of times on TV, and I rewatched it recently because of the book, and I was just thinking, was I right? And I watched it, and yeah, I was. I find it a badly directed film. I find it tonally all over the place. I don't think it knows what it wants to be. And, the CGI is horrific.
Well, I've yet to revisit it. I will do very shortly, I'm sure, because it has to be done. I revisited GoldenEye and I enjoyed it, and I didn't think I was going to, and so it's time definitely to give that a second chance.
Fair enough, yeah.
Well, let's get on with this interview because we're talking about you. So, your favourite Bond book? What would your favourite Bond book be? Now, you can interpret that as novel or book about Bond or book about the films or anything you like.
I think the novels. I think On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a really good novel, and so is Thunderball. I think that three, the Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and You Only Live Twice, as sort of trilogy, really, really hold together really well. I think Casino Royale is still a stonking great novel, though. And it might be the best one. I haven't read them in a long time. I devoured them, sort of in my teenage years, and then revisited a couple of them. But I think, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a really thrilling novel, and it's because it's got the sort of the heart to it as well, and I think that's really good. And I didn't mention that earlier in the great films, and of course that's a really good movie.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I'm pleased you can stay. You can stay.
Yeah, good.
You're allowed to stay now. So if you had to pick a favourite Bond girl, question number 3, which one would that be?
I have a lot of time for Mariam DeBow, actually, as Cara Mallovi.
These are all great answers.
And it's something I talk about in the book, and I think her journey is really interesting as a character.
Yeah.
I think she is one of the few Bond girls who actually develops as a character. Because, sometimes Bond girls, they turn up... the worst one is probably Britt Ekland. in Man with the Golden Gun, and she nearly kills Bond by bending over. And I always remember that.
She actually seems to devolve as the film goes on. She starts off as a fellow Secret Service colleague, and she knows more than Bond does, because he doesn't know where these golden Rolls Royces come from, and she answers that quick instantly. And then as the film goes on, she gets less and less intelligent. And
it happens with in Spy Who Loved Me as well. With Anya, she's like this agent, and she's really tough, but by the end, she gets tied up in an evening gown and she's useless. Whereas Kara starts off useless and innocent, and actually as the film progresses becomes a much more interesting character. And it helps that she looks fantastic as well all the way through. But she's a very different Bond girl, and I really liked her for that. But there's Diana Rigg. It's difficult. It's difficult not to say Diana Rigg at any point.
Well, if you had to pick one based on character?
On character, Diana Rigg. There we go. We'll go with Tracy.
There we go. Okay, so that's both of those sorted. If you had to pick another, I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say here. If you had to pick a favourite Bond actor...
Well, that's going to be Timothy Dalton. However, I would say that each one, they're so different, they get difficult to compare. I have a lot of love for Roger Moore, who gets kicked around a lot these days as well. But he did a very specific thing very well. But for me, Dalton, I guess because it was fresh, but also he emulated the novels, and the character that I saw in Fleming's work, I thought Dalton was getting closer than anybody else. Now, that's personal reading, because every time they cast a new James Bond, they always say, this person is closer to the novels than the last person. But I always thought he got that conflict, and you know what? He looks like he could kill you. There's a moment in Living Daylights where Saunders has been killed, and there's the balloon. There's a Schmidt-Spionum, and he looks furious. And I thought, I buy you as a professional killer in a way that I don't buy the other guys, whereas they look more interested in, the martinis or the suits or whatever. And I thought Dalton got that moral complexity that's in Fleming. This is a guy who drinks and smokes because he kills people for a living, and that's a difficult thing. And that's something that they don't really get in the other portrayals, I think.
I think if you were to pick apart every single one of the actors, though, you'd find at least one moment in all of their films where they have that similar sort of look in their eye, where you think, oh, hang on, I'm going to back away from this fella. I think Brosnan has it in Word Is Not Enough a couple of times. He just becomes this very cold, angry person. I'm sure Roger Moore wouldn't like to be remembered as the guy that kicked the car off the cliff, because I know he didn't like that scene very much, but it was very brutal. And
I was really happy. I would have happily had Roger Moore do more of that. And when I've watched them back, it's interesting, because Live and Let Die and Man with the Golden Gun, he's a lot tougher in those two than he is Spy Who Loved Me. There's a real shift, and I think Live and Let Die is great fun, and his portrayal is very different there.
Certainly in Golden Gun, he's quite unfair to Miss Anders when he first meets her.
Oh, absolutely. He's rough, and
it's a difficult thing to watch actually now, looking at it. It hasn't aged well, or it has. It's aged least well politically, but if you were to look at that as one of the few moments where Fleming's Bond came out in Roger Moore, that's actually a pretty tough moment.
I mean, it is a problem with a character like Bond, because he's a product of a 1950s era. It's he's written by a public schoolboy who served in military intelligence. He's going to have values that we're going to struggle with today in certain ways. And what I liked about going back to Dalton is that they managed to update the world but preserve the character, I thought.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the female characters have become much more independent and strong, but Bond's still allowed to, drink and smoke and be this difficult sort of person. Now, that might be problematic for a blockbuster. It probably is, because you have to have a hero that everybody, is going to link up to and like. But, again, on that personal level, I find it fascinating. But I'm kind of drawn to that moral complexity, I think.
It's certainly complicated for the other characters in the film, but we'll get onto that a little bit more in a moment. So what is your earliest Bond memory? Question number 5.
I think it will be probably Octopussy going down to the local video rental, which was in a petrol station, and taking out the box. And I remember that was, for whatever reason, Octopussy, maybe it was the only one they had, but that one seemed to get rented a lot. So I remember that, and it's quite good fun, Octopussy, but it's a less serious film. It's got great moments in it, and some of the stunt work is fab. And then it's got the Tarzan yell, so, you know.
Now I can look beyond that. When it does get quite serious, it's one of the most serious films in the series up to that point. The leading up to the atomic bomb diffusion is incredible. It's almost like it's lifted from another film.
It feels like a spy, a serious spy thriller, John le Carre sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I quite, some people have criticised it, but I quite like the fact that he ends up dressed as a clown diffusing this bomb. It gives this surrealness to it.
I love the Avengers. I've always loved that kind of slightly weird, slightly surreal iconography that you get that mixes secret sort of spying, but also, people dressed as undertakers, people dressed as clowns. There'll be a bomb in a pushchair or something like that. So I quite like. Seeing that in Octopussy didn't feel wrong at all. It felt like, it's perfectly fine. It's slightly morbid, but slightly
but an interesting morbid, but then you get the Tarzan yell, or you get the Barbara Woodhouse sit moment, and something I mentioned actually is I find the last few of Moore's films, probably all the John Glenn directed ones, don't quite know whether they're serious or not. So they keep and I don't mind it, but looking back, it's sort of odd. You get it in A View to a Kill, where Christopher Walken just guns down everybody in the mine. And Roger Moore objected quite a lot to that sequence, because, and then at the same time, you've got, clearly a stunt double doing loads of things, or he's getting whacked in the groin by an aerial while dangling from the balloon. You think, how do these things sit together? And I think it's an issue with some of those films.
Yeah, it can be done sparingly, but if it's done far too often, you're right. It can conflict with how we're supposed to be viewing the sort of tone of the film.
Yeah. I always find that. I generally find that an issue with movies where they don't seem to know what they are. But that's just a personal. I think that might just be me.
Okay, so question number 6. What Bond locations have you visited, or which ones would you like to visit?
Wow. I have remarkably few, actually. It was a very good question. I've been around sort of London areas, Millennium Dome and those sorts of stuff. Eiffel Tower I've been to. Where would I like to go?
Did you parachute off the top?
No, apparently that doesn't work, or they get very angry with you in Paris if you do that.
Do they? Oh, okay, I won't do that.
I think, you know what, I'd like to go to Pinewood. I would be more interested to go to Pinewood than I would a real place.
And you've not done that yet?
No, I've not done that. They don't do tours or anything, so I need to go to, an event or something there. I'm very lazy. Okay,
so question number 7 then. What is your favourite scene in the entire film? In the entire series?
That's a hideous question.
It is.
It is. I do like the opening of Licence to Kill. I think the whole helicopter dangling, going fishing is great. I think the use of music there is really good, and I think the sort of the heightened reality, it's a stunt that you can see actually working in real life. So I better mention that. The opening of Spy Who Loved Me though, and the parachute jump is still brilliant. I'll go probably with one of those two.
Okay. It's got to be falling from a great height, though, is it?
Clearly, because I don't, it's not something I want to do myself. But I think you want the Bond films, when they manage to be outrageous but still have a foot in reality, are brilliant, and I think those moments are fantastic. Yeah, I think one of those two opening sequences, probably. Yeah, why not?
That's fine. That'll do, and you won't be alone with those choices. So question number 8 of the 7 questions is, what is the most Bondian thing you've ever done?
Oh my God, that's a fabulous question. You know what? He's not been there, but I did get to go and stand on the Great Wall of China, which is very exciting. And that's just like the perfect Bond location. And you stood up there, and funnily enough, License to Kill was nearly set in China. It's not something I discuss in the book because it wasn't really relevant, but early doors they were looking at that and thinking, can we film there? And I think, being there, or I also got to go to the Forbidden City in Beijing. That was cool. So those two things were sort of, quite Bondian locations, even though he's not been there. The other thing was, and I mentioned it discreetly in the book, is that I do briefly appear in a James Bond video game, 007 Legends, which is a fine game on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox. And I entered a competition and I got digitized in. And you can shoot me a lot. And I told my students this, and they did, and it was fun.
They enjoyed killing you.
On multiplayer, you can have 4 people just being me, shooting me. It's very surreal.
So you're dressed as one of Drax space agents.
I'm listed as a Drax Henchman. And there was a competition on Activision, the developer's website. And it was to design and write a Bond villain. And I found this and thought, well, why not? Let's do it. So I remembered a surname I saw many years ago on a notice board at university. And I can't remember the lady's first name, but her last name was Kildfeather. Kilfeather. And at that point, my brain went, that's a Bond surname, if ever there's a Bond surname. So 20 years later, that dragged out of my brain. And I had to submit a photo, and my wife had done a kind of cool photo that looked like the poster for the Dustin Hoffman film Straw Dogs, when she was playing, because she's a fabulous photographer. So I submitted this, and I won. A guy in America won. He's in on Her Majesty's Secret Service level, so he's one of those guys. And I'm a Drax Henchman with the full yellow jumpsuit and weird soft helmet thing. Yeah,
that is awesome.
Moonraker came out the year I was born, so I'm quite pleased. It feels quite suitable somehow.
Very few people can boast that they've actually been in Moonraker with Daniel Craig, but you have.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a little odd that Daniel Craig was there, but there you go.
That just makes it more unique. So let's go back to you as a. Well, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a lecturer. I'm a film lecturer, film and media. So that's my day job, and I've been doing that for 13 years.
Right. So you teach production?
No, I teach studies. I don't put me anywhere near a camera. I'm going to put that out now. I'm technically inept, but what I do is I do the film studies. So I teach the A levels at the minute, and I teach basically things like genre and narrative structure and those sorts of ideas, and what we call reading a film, so breaking it down, but also about the film industry and the influences of the film industry. And that's my background. Originally I did an English degree, but during the English degree I sort of thought, hang on a minute, I really ought to be doing film here. So I finished the English degree, and I've gone on to study film, first at Masters, and then more recently I did the PhD. And I'm really lucky. I just get to communicate a love of film with people, and it's really, generally speaking, quite good fun.
It sounds like it's more fun than it should be. So is it taken seriously as a qualification?
It depends who you talk to. Film and media. Film is taken more seriously than media because film is more like literature. So film has a sort of a slightly more serious, you get Freudian theories and those sorts of things, semiotic theory and stuff. Whereas media has the tinge of sociology about it, so media is slightly less seriously taken. In terms of, is it serious or not? New subjects always sound less serious by some people. Having studied both English and film, you can't get a cigarette paper between them in terms of their level or their content. It's just one is doing it with Shakespeare and one is doing it with Blade Runner, which we were doing recently. The theories are similar and the content is similar. And as time goes on, they're taken more seriously. However, I am aware that the idea of a media studies degree is still sort of taken a little humorously by some people. My big pitch for it is actually they're increasingly important, whether it's film or media, is we live in a increasingly visual environment. We're doing this, on audio, but we're also seeing each other, and screens are dominating our lives, and I think it's really important that people think about that and start to deconstruct how we consume visual information, whether that's movies or TV or, the internet. And when you look at whether the American election where Trump was elected, the influence of things like Facebook now is massive, whereas previously it wasn't. But we don't have great media literacy. We don't have a great knowledge of analysing the media. So although some people will sniff at these subjects, I think they're increasingly relevant and increasingly matter to everyday life.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it. When I did it, it was purely because I was too scared to get a job. So I would go from one media course to the next. And I thought eventually I'm going to have to get a job. I'm going to have to do something to earn some money. So, explain, is film studies an excuse to read too much into something that wasn't there?
There's always a risk. And I think you've got to be careful that you don't depart from the film. It's very easy to sort of develop a theory and go, well, very excited, and then sit down and watch the movie, but the film doesn't do that. So you've always got to go back to the film and say, did it happen? Does anything support that? Can it go to... I don't know. I think how people watch things and how we interact with movies is really important. I think they're really defining. We're talking about Bond films because they clearly had a massive impact on our lives. And your listeners are those people who grew up with them. And they've, to a certain extent, shaped them. And that's what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in how we understand movies, but in a sense, how movies then influence or impact our lives and change who we are. And I think that's a really core aspect of an identity. For those of us particularly who grew up with VHS players, if you were like me, you're just saturated in these things. So something's got to be going on there. And there's theories either way. However, some of the stuff I've read that I've had to read, you do think it just sort of disappears up itself. Because you read it and you think, okay, you're not really saying anything. What's the point in this? So, like any field of study, it has the potential to get abstract. And people, I think, have the potential to write stuff for the sake of complexity rather than for the sake of communication. I hope I've not done that, but it's tempting.
I definitely have.
If you get in that academic bubble, and I've been to some conferences and I've spoken at a couple, and you listen to people speaking, you think you've said nothing in a very complicated way. So it has the potential, but I do think, if we took Bond movies away, would you and I be different people?
I don't think I'd exist.
Yeah. So there's a little corner of your personality that's been shaped, formed, and maybe it's a big corner, but it's been deeply influenced, and that I think is that's what I find interesting. I also find the structure of movies interesting, and I was rewatched The Shining recently. I love The Shining. Oh yes. But The Shining is a bonkers movie. It's almost like an opposite horror movie. Everything is shot in broad light. It has, it doesn't have dark corners, and yet I still find it a deeply weird and not exactly scary experience, but it still gets to me in that sort of disturbing sort of way. So there's the idea of working out, structurally how that works in terms of lighting, but also, how does that affect you, and how do we react to these things? I do find fascinating.
Quite famously, Psycho is the film that seems to get picked apart in film studies. Obviously, quite important in the horror genre, but also it was a milestone for Hitchcock. It was a milestone for American films and censorship. The way the storyline set up one character and then completely removed them from the story and disorientated the audience, and then made them start to appreciate another character instead. All these sort of things mean that the film can be endlessly picked apart and studied and over-studied. But The Shining, quite recently there was a documentary called Room...
I love that. Room 237.
Yes. Yeah. And that is an amalgamation of online theorists, bloggers and YouTube posters who have watched The Shining too many times and have done exactly what you have done in your book for The Shining. And for the most part, those theories of The Shining can also be backed up.
Well, the thing is, I remember watching Room 237, and I started like thinking, oh, the moon. Yeah, maybe Kubrick did fake the moon landing. Maybe. It's like I was getting quite sucked in by some of it. Look, if you got a theoretical perspective and there's evidence, I guess you could argue anything if you wanted to. What my interested in is just looking back at movies and opening them up and hoping, helping people watch them maybe in a slightly different way and a slightly more, giving it a bit more depth. But yeah, you could do. It's like the theory that Lee Tamahori had about James Bond, that it's a code name versus a single person. Or you could start generating all these things, and the internet has really, of course, helped that. Is that fan theories and all these ideas, and they're kind of fun. But I guess there comes a point of differentiating between stuff that makes sense and stuff that doesn't. But some of the stuff that doesn't quite make sense is still good fun.
Just out of interest, what were the other films that people were writing about on your in the PhD course that you were doing?
Well, the PhD was kind of interesting because I was a lone wolf because I was working full time. So my PhD thesis is nothing to do with James Bond. The James Bond stuff goes back to my MA stuff. My PhD thesis is about vigilante cinema in the 1970s. So Death Wish, Dirty Harry, French Connection, Straw Dogs I mentioned, Joe, and finally Taxi Driver.
Right.
And that was looking at those films and going, you know what? These films did not exist before 1970. They didn't exist. So why did they exist then? And politically, what's going on? Because if you go back and look at the original critiques of them, the original sort of critics, they were appalled by these films. They decried them as fascist, as inciting people to gun violence, that people would go out and sort of wrecking things. Now, we know that didn't happen. So I was going back and looking at that sort of the critical reaction to the films, but also different ways that we can interpret the films and see them in different ways, and how that sort of has ramifications later on. Because I'm quite fascinated by movies that flirt with that sort of far right. I mean, one of my favourite films is Robocop.
Yeah, okay.
But Robocop has definitely, you could see Robocop as having this fascist element if you wanted to. In fact, all Paul Verhoeven's films does, like Starship Troopers, which is also brilliant. Mm. But you can read it either ironically, or you could take it at face value. And so I'm kind of interested in those political aspects of movies, which is interesting if you come back to James Bond, because there is an element of the Empire going in and sort of British identity and what those values mean. And they're very fascinating things. So that was the sort of the PhD. So I was sort of sat there on my own. But I've been to conferences. I went to a conference recently about New Hollywood, which is the period in Hollywood after Easy Rider comes out, basically. And there's one, actually, it was really good fun, by a guy I know called Neil Jackson. He did a paper on exploitation movies based on Jaws, which was fascinating to see all the different weird Jaws rip-offs that were made. Including one guy who's done a Jaws, it's called the Exploitation Edit, where he's taken Jaws and edited it to be terrible. And he's put in different music, and he's put in scenes from other worse movies. And he's like taken Jaws, and I think Jaws is great, but he's taken Jaws and made it a really cheap-looking B-movie. And it's bizarre. But there's this whole weird industry now of taking movies, and, it's very much YouTube and internet-driven, taking movies and making them... different and, fan edits and what have you. And he was looking at that, so that was cool. But sometimes you do get into something where somebody is going down sort of the Freudian route, or some of the psychoanalysis stuff, which I don't mind toe dipping in, but I do sometimes worry that we end up, and Psycho's a good example of that, we can end up talking about trying to use a film as a metaphor for the rest of life, and I'm not entirely convinced that works.
Talking about Freudian... Yeah. Can I read a bit from your book?
Oh, this will serve me right. Yeah, go for it.
So this is an examination of the scene in License to Kill where M asks for Bond to hand his gun back. Right then, so later in the film, M sends an agent to stop Bond one way or another. A break in their relationship appears here for the first time, one confirmed when M demands Bond returns his Walther PPK. This gun, used in most of the Bond films, was presented to Bond in M's office in the first film, Dr. No, as a replacement for his previous firearm, a Beretta 418, described by M's armourer as nice and light for a lady's handbag. The Walther PPK symbolises Bond's legitimacy and is a key part of his identity. He's often identified by the gun. But it also represents his relationship to M, the father figure. This is added extra piquancy by the suggestion that the PPK acts as a phallic symbol, the power given to him by M and part of the symbolic system that has M as its head. Removing this suggests castration, a removal of what Bond never has of his own, but one he holds conditionally. As Bond escapes with the PPK, he claims this symbol for himself, no longer requiring M's approval or endorsement. Later in the film, Bond's PPK is removed by Sanchez, who claims the Isthmus is a safe city, upon which Bond asks Pam for her gun. She passes him a Beretta, a similar gun to the one which he originally had. In this, Bond symbolically reclaims his original weapon and thus achieves self-determination. By cutting the umbilical cord to M, Bond symbolically grows up.
Yeah, I can't believe I used the word piquancy. That's really embarrassing, actually. There you go. That serves me right. Yeah, what did you think? I'm going to ask you what you think.
I may have murdered it there by reading it quite the way that I did. Well, I find that fascinating. I find it absolutely fascinating because it is forcing me to look at these films that I know and love and have really mostly only admired as either entertainment or on a technical level. Yeah. Because, you know, I do a bit of film production anyway, and I look at that and I think, I like what they've done there. I can see why that works. I can see why these edits work. But I very rarely read between the lines of what's in the script. And what you've done and what film studies does is encourages people to read things that are barely suggested and elaborate upon them. And for me to find that was hidden in License to Kill and I had no idea about it, I find that fascinating.
That's great. I mean, it's something that I can't remember where I picked up on it first, and I think it's the moment where he gets Pam's Beretta, and I remember looking at that image and thinking, that's really familiar. So you go back to Doctor Now, and of course this is different to the novels because the order of the films is different to the novel order, and it all gets terribly mixed up. But the idea... Now, it is a bit sort of Freudian, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I don't mind a bit of that. I think that we have to be careful. When we get down to Oedipal narratives and stuff, I start to panic, because that's kind of... possibly rubbish, but it's interesting rubbish. But with the idea of M as a father figure, I think is sort of makes sense to me, and the idea that he is the person who sends Bond out, and that basically puts Bond in a childish relationship, and License to Kill breaks that, and it actually goes and yeah, the gun becomes symbolic. If you want to go down the phallic signifier, I quite enjoy doing that because it's quite good fun. But I understand that some people are like, really. But it does suggest legitimacy. It is his license to kill in a sense, and that gun is so synonymous with Bond. I remember being really annoyed when they replaced it with the Walther P99. And I was like, that's not the right gun. You've got to have the right gun.
It's far bigger though, far more phallic.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends if I mean, back with Dirty Harry, he's got the biggest one of them all, and we could go. But it does suggest power, and it does suggest strength, and it does suggest all those things. And I think the fact that License to Kill really breaks that M relationship is the most important thing. It really recasts that as a much more tense, problematic relationship. And that, for me, is a really interesting moment in the whole franchise, because they had problems before. There's that bit on Her Majesty's Secret Service where he goes out and he tells Moneypenny he's going to quit, and she has to write a letter, and she doesn't, and he's relieved, he's happy about it. But here, their relationship breaks down, and it's a sort of fundamental aspect of the whole series. So there's a real shift in that dynamic in the two films, and I don't know if people found that upsetting. I find it fascinating. And yeah, Bond becomes self-determining. He's no longer taking orders. He's doing what he wants to do, and the gun kind of becomes sort of symbolic of that, I thought.
And looking at the other films, I tried to do a little sort of list of all the times where that has happened before and after. And the only one I can really think of before, you mentioned Majesty's there where he tries to quit. The only other one I could think of off the top of my head was a moment in Man with the Golden Gun where refuses to allow Bond to fly off to Scaramanga's Island, which is in Chinese waters. He said, I can't do that. The PM will, I can't remember the exact phrasing that he says. The PM will have my guts for garters or something along those lines. That's what he says in Daylight. Bond's reply is, well, officially, sir, you won't know a thing about it.
Yeah. He's like a naughty child at that point, though, isn't he? He's like, let's all have plausible deniability. If I can't see you do it, it didn't happen, did it? And it's still charming, and there's still a friendliness there or paternalness there, which is ditched. And it was funny because I thought when Judi Dench came in with Brosnan, that was quite an aggressive. It starts off, and as the films, it softens and they get warmer, and they lost that tension. But I think that having that tension there's quite interesting. Dramatically, it's another layer into the movie. But it's really distinct with Dalton that he possibly doesn't like his job, which is an interesting problem for a James Bond film.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's not really alluded to in any of the other films. But going back to thinking about which other films he does actively disobey his superiors, pretty much every film since The World Is Not Enough, he's done something against his orders, whether that is just doing something he shouldn't have done or completely going rogue and essentially leaving the service or pretending he's dead, faking his own death in Skyfall. Yeah. So do you think is this Dalton's fault?
No, I think he was ahead of his time. I think it's one of those things where they got slightly ahead of maybe how we feel about authority is different these days. And I think, back in when Fleming was writing, and certainly in the 60s, we accepted structures of authority very happily. Nobody really questions whether we, should have a monarchy, all those sorts of things. Everybody just accepts it. These days, we're much more ambivalent about our politicians. We don't trust them very much, generally speaking. And so we don't trust governments very much, honestly. And I think that was creeping in the late 80s when Dalton's films were happening. But I think it's just an accepted thing. If you compare it, interestingly, to the Mission Impossible franchise, and I watched the most recent one recently, which I know it was a cracking good film, actually. But every Mission Impossible film, there's a point where Tom Cruise is disavowed by the agency and sets off on his own. So we've clearly got to a point, and Jason Bourne as well. We no longer feel warm about those governmental institutions like we used to, and I think Dalton's films get it early. I think they're just on the start of that, and now we accept that the disobeying your orders would be okay. Once upon a time, that would have been quite a shocking thing, maybe.
Yeah. So there's a nice big bibliography at the back of your book. Now, is it okay to call it a book? Because is it technically a paper? Is it technically...
It's technically a monograph, which is basically a cheat's way of saying it's too short for a book but too long for a paper.
Okay.
So it's a monograph, so it's a short work on a single subject.
I see.
Technical term.
But you have made the decision to make it public.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm getting at an age. I'm about to hit 40. And it's like, what's the harm? The worst that's going to happen is one person reads it, thinks that was a piece of rubbish, puts it in the bin. It's not going to kill me either way. And so that's been really important. It's been a very interesting year, not to go dark, but back in April, I was diagnosed with quite a serious disease, which is fine. I'm getting treatment for it, so it's not going to kill me. It's called PNH, and it's incredibly rare. But it was one of those moments where you think, you know what, why not try some stuff? Why not just take a moment and think? And I was digging through boxes and I found all my old research and I read it and I thought, you know what, there's something in this. It needs working up, it needs shifting, it needs rewriting. Some of the research was done quite a long time ago, 10 years ago odd. But I thought it's no harm saying it. Somebody might get a bang out of it. I'll never be at that point where you think, oh, I wish I'd done something with that. Let's just throw it out there and see what happens. And, you've liked it, which is fab, and you've been very nice. And now we're talking, which is great. So I'm now doing something new again. And, there's absolutely no harm. And I've been trying to write. I've written for a couple of online journals as well. I'm just something I like doing. Hopefully people will like reading it. So it's sort of like, why not? And if people call me an idiot, I've been called worse things. And also, just on a sort of personal academic level, and I think you alluded to this, is that often in academic circles, people discuss movies, obscure movies, seriously. So they will talk about a movie that nobody watches, and they will take it very, very seriously. And I'm actually interested in the movies that people watch, because I think they're the ones that matter. You know, we talked about The Shining. Shining is, you know, is watched and watched and watched. That matters. The Bond films matter because they impact so many people in loads of different ways. You know, for some of us, that was, you know, the first time we saw a kiss on screen would have been Roger Moore and Maud Adams or something, you know, and all these little things percolate. Our definitions maybe of masculinity, or our ideal sense of what a person should be, was James Bond. And that to me matters a lot more than maybe, and I'm not denigrating it, but some obscure, you know, Polish film maybe, that actually outside of the art house and academic circles nobody's going to watch. So for me, it's similar. I have a similar relationship with comic book movies. I think are really important, and I'm currently oddly writing about horror a lot, which is interesting to me because I never used to like horror at all. But horror's a really interesting genre for the way it really, you know, talks to its audience very directly about what scares you, and I'm starting to find that quite interesting. So yeah, but sometimes you just have to put your balls out there and see if somebody kicks them, I guess.
Well, I hope they don't do that. So there were two things that you mentioned in your, well, quite a few things that you mentioned in your book, but the two things that that stood out for me, you spend 100 odd pages defending these films and celebrating them, and there were two particular instances where you pointed out that these films really aren't for everybody. One of those was was a book that Alan Barnes and Marcus Hearn wrote, which is called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which is an unofficial Bond film reviewing book.
Yeah, they hated License to Kill.
I really like that book. I have to say, it's got an awful lot of very interesting behind the scenes stuff in it, but I can't get to grips with why they hate License to Kill.
And they hate Dalton in License to Kill. I mean, they give him, I think they score everything out of 10, and they give him 1 out of 10. Yeah. Like, this is not James Bond, this is not right. And I remember reading that, and similar to you, I thought, this is a great book. And then I got there and I thought, you idiots, what are you thinking? But there is something really divisive about Dalton. I mean, there always is when there's a new Bond. Some people are going to love it, some people are going to hate it. I'm fascinated by George Lazenby because for years he was almost like, you know, if you're rubbish, you're the George Lazenby of something. Now we all watch that movie and go, actually, he's pretty good. It's a shame he didn't do more films. And anybody who does a top 5 Bond films, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is almost always in there. Because it's such a well-made, well-crafted, well-written film.
Someone needs to do a documentary about the editing of that film.
Yes.
So there was also something else that you picked up on, and that was Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian.
That was Peter Bradshaw, right, yeah.
It was about October this year, maybe September.
I was literally putting the finishing touches to it and just agonising over words and just, you know, checking again for spellings because you go blind. And it popped up in The Guardian. It was about the time that I think, it's probably when Danny Boyle left the new Bond film. And so that prompted people, lots of discussions. And so this list came up. And there was Dalton down at the bottom. And I was just like, oh, I'm fed up now. Because I don't think it's fair. And I don't understand it at all. But then I don't like Skyfall. So, and... You know, that's the most successful James Bond film ever made.
That was quite high up on his list, wasn't it?
It was. And I don't get Skyfall at all. So I'm not sure whether that reflects more on me than anything else. What do you think of Skyfall?
I do share a similar opinion. I've trying to be as positive about every aspect of Bond as I possibly can whilst I'm in front of this microphone. But there are certain elements with regards to the script of the films over the last 10 years that I have an issue with, but that doesn't stop them from being A, incredibly popular, and B, the most successful films of the franchise financially so far. So what the hell do I know?
Well, that's what I feel about it, yeah.
It was very interesting that Peter Bradshaw's list, Peter Bradshaw, film critic in The Guardian newspaper in the UK, listed the Bond films from 1 to 24 in his favourite top 24, and he put the 2 Dalton films at the bottom. Basically, that was it, because he just didn't like them. Or I put it to you, he hasn't seen them for 25 years, and he just thought, well, I don't remember them being very good. Nobody else seems to like them. That's where they're staying in my mind.
And I think there's a prejudice, and that's one of the reasons I did this, actually, is because, I've noticed online, because, I'm a member of some Facebook groups, and there's your fantastic, podcast and stuff, and you notice there's a creeping like of Dalton. And I don't know if it's those of us of a certain age, and we saw it at a less prejudiced moment or something. But I'm just thinking, you know what, it's about time we just came out and said, these films are good. It's okay to like them. They're not the worst in the franchise. I know that's subjective, but there's lots of reasons why they work. And to reclaim them from the dismissal of the Peter Bradshaws. And there's lots of myths. I remember reading once, I don't mention this book because I couldn't find the reference, where somebody, talked about how Dalton, in one of his movies made quiche. And I was thinking, no, he didn't. That was Roger Moore. It's like all the bad things sort of stick to Dalton's version, even if they're not there.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it was a weird, it's like a really obscure reference, and I couldn't find where I read it. I don't think I'm making it up. Or the idea that he was some sort of safe sex Bond.
Yeah, and I definitely have read, there is Leonard Maltin, who's sort of the American version of maybe Barry Norman.
Yeah, very well-respected guy, yeah.
He brings out a big movie review book once every year. Yeah. And I have no doubt now that he goes back and rewrites certain entries because, he's seen them again and changed his mind. I distinctly remember reading his entry on The Living Daylights, where he says that Bond is seen using a condom for the first time. Now, I may have misinterpreted that over time, and he may have written safe sex. Which in a way, kind of, you could see why he would have said that, because really, apart from Linda in the opening titles, there's only really Cara in the film. Yeah. So in a kind of way, that is paring down the amount of sex that he's having, which is kind of, sort of, safe sex, sort of, kind of. Well,
I mentioned, I do mention it in the book, and I think John Glenn, the director, to talk about, it's mid-80s, AIDS is just everywhere. Yeah. So it was in their mind. The other thing, though, is I think if you're going to give a character like Cara room to develop as a character, that cuts down the amount of time you can give to other women in the movie. And I think that's true of both License to Kill and The Living Daylights. By giving the women that are in the movie more time to develop and be actual people, that means that you don't get those, the litany of one-night stands that Roger Moore has in, say, Spy Love Me turns up in a tent in the middle of nowhere dressed as a sheik, and some bloke goes, borrow my missus or whatever,
Yeah.
So is that safe sex? I don't know.
Well, he certainly doesn't use a condom on screen, and I'd like to know in which kind of, what sort of Bond film would you be watching where you actually saw him using a condom on screen?
The only film I can see where anybody's ever used a condom is in The Naked Gun, where they use giant comedy condoms, and that's the only film that I can think of.
He might be able to use it as some sort of gadget. He'd use it to sort of fix an engine if the fan belt's gone or something like that.
But it's a parody moment, isn't it? Bond goes to Q and he gets outfitted with condoms or something. It's a Mad Magazine level.
Yeah.
But again, it's the idea that Dalton's is safe sex, and I actually see it, like I say, as a positive. It's about giving the female characters more complexity, and if you go back to the books, he's not sleeping with that many women in the books. There's usually a main girl, maybe another one, and they become important characters within the story. And I think that's what Dalton's films are doing, is saying let's take the women seriously. And honestly, a lot of the other movies don't.
Yeah, I've got some interviews with Timothy Dalton where he happily describes The Living Daylights as a romantic film.
Yeah,
and in a lot of ways it is, because once Kara's on the scene, there is no one else in his life, and he does treat her with respect. He's not eyeing up other women. He does father her in a way. He's looking after her until they achieve what they set out to achieve, which is finding Georgy Koskov. So in that sense, he's kind of protecting her anyway. So yeah,
I think you're right though. It is romantic. The scenes on the Ferris wheel and in Vienna and are very romantic scenes, and are suggesting it's not a one night stand, but also that if you want to be cynical, he kind of has to romance her because he needs to get away from Koskov as well. So I guess you could flip that.
You could also, if you were being even more cynical, suggest that his seduction of Kara is a little bit forced.
Yeah.
And a little bit rapey, maybe just a tiny bit. But because he's not letting, I'll take her somewhere where she can't run away.
He's lying terribly to her.
Yeah. We'll go into the top of this Ferris wheel so she can't climb out the window. And I'll arrange it so that we can't move for the next half an hour.
You could see it that way, yes.
But yeah, some people might see that as a good thing, and others may not. What do you think? Tell me, what do you think of Michael Wilson as a scriptwriter? Because he was very key with regards to License to Kill, wasn't he?
He was, and he kind of took over. Richard Maybaum, who'd written most of the Bond films, I think it was a writer's strike. And so Wilson came in. I think he's very efficient. I think the films are really well structured that he's involved in. And I think there was a push-pull. I mentioned a bit earlier in the other John Glenn films of tone, and I think License to Kill is the one that has a much more consistent tone, and I think that's Michael Wilson. He closes down locations, so we don't get the globe trotting. And he sort of structures it, and it's a classic 3-act structure of a movie and all those sorts of things. But I have no problem with him. I guess they're not as funny, and maybe the lack of wit is in there. But I think there's some good jokes. I mean, the laundering the money joke in License to Kill is great, and those sorts of moments.
Do you think this might be a loaded question?
Go on.
Do you think he should still be writing them?
No, because I think I don't know who should be writing the movies. I think it's very difficult to know because he's kind of, you don't see him that much. Barbara Broccoli has really become the face of the movies, and I don't know how they work these things out and how that. I think the choice of director is having more of an influence than the writers. I found some of the director choices since Brosnan really odd. Roger Spottiswoode, who directed Tomorrow Never Dies, his most important other film is Stop or My Mum Will Shoot.
It's very rare that that's referred to as an important film, but
well, yeah, I'm sure it paid them more. He's not a director that I got much excitement for. Michael Apted, I think, is a good director, but an odd choice for a Bond film. Lee Tamahori, who did Die Another Day, I thought was a good idea until I saw the film, and then I was wrong. And similar with Mark Forster, again, an odd choice. And I quite like bits of Quantum of Solace, which again is one of those films where we're not supposed to like. It's down the bottom. I mean, I think the whole action scene around Tosca at the Opera House is fab, and the way it's edited and it cross-cuts between, the different action scenes and uses the music is really cool. But, I thought Danny Boyle was an odd choice, and now he's gone. So I think it's more to do with the choice of directors and then the influence that maybe the actor is having over the script. I think Daniel Craig is pretty influential. They're paying him tons of money to do these movies, and they want to keep hold of him because, obviously he's made them, a lot of money, people like him. So I think there's a lot of people steering it. You go back to the Broccoli Saltzman days, I mean, yeah, they ended up hating each other, but you get a sense of stability there and a sense of we're going in this direction. Then Broccoli took over. Now I think everything seems a bit committee-led and compromised, but I think that's Hollywood filmmaking generally. And I think I often look at movies and you look at the amount of writers on it or the amount of people involved, and you think, no, did nobody have an idea? Whether Wilson writing one would solve that or not, I don't know. But I think it would be nice if somebody had a strong vision and was able to carry it out. I'll put it that way.
Okay. Well, fingers crossed for the next one. You've got somebody involved with your Christian name, so
yes. Yeah, Cary. I can't pronounce his. How do we pronounce his surname?
Fukunaga.
There you go. Yeah, cool. And I don't know his TV work, so he was a real sort of shock to me. I was really surprised by him. I mean, don't we all just want Christopher Nolan to do it?
Well, some of us do, yes. Some of us maybe think he might want a little bit too much control. I thought if he was going to direct a Bond film, he would probably want to write it too, because that seems to be the way. He's obviously been very successful, and he would probably want that to be part of the deal. And the problem with writing it and directing it is very often you are the author of the entire thing, and there may not be someone holding you back to say, hang on a minute, that doesn't work.
I think that's fair, and I think you're probably right. If he was to sign on to do it, he would want to write it his way, cast it his way, do the music his way. And it depends. I guess it depends how reverential it is. But then again,
that might be a great thing. He might have a fantastic vision, and diluting it by letting someone else say, hang on, that's not going to work, probably might be a bad thing. So going back to License to Kill very quickly, there is a very interesting bit in your book where you mentioned about Sanchez having a character arc. Don't all well-written villains have character arcs then?
I'm not sure. Look, I think Goldfinger's great, and I think he's a fun character, but I think he's other than being sucked out of a plane at the end, he's pretty much the same guy. I don't think his motivation is gold. Okay, cool, and that works, and I'm not criticising that, but I think the way that Sanchez falls apart during the course of the movie, to the point where he has this one thing, loyalty, that is his big sort of moral compass, and it starts to fall apart, and he starts to shoot people, and what Bond does in that movie, he doesn't just go after the bad guy, he kind of breaks him down and destroys him, and then sets him on fire. Which is an incredible stunt, actually.
Paul Weston.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yes, he was in real trouble during the filming of that, actually. We did an interview with him last year, and he said he had an air supply which would last about a minute, and he'd used up most of his oxygen by the time they actually shouted action. So the moment he was on fire and everyone got out of the way of the camera, he had no oxygen left. So he was doing the entire thing just holding his breath. Well,
that makes it even better stunt.
Yeah, you know that there's peril behind the cameras as well, which is.
And you also get that shot where Dalton runs away from the exploding tanker, and you just think, oh, they just put Timothy Dalton in front of an exploding tanker and told him to run away, and it's really serious. But I think back with Sanchez, I think the development of the character and his interaction with Bond suggests that there's more going on than just evil bad guy. And I think some of the Bond films, Stromberg, say in Spy Who Loved Me, or Drax, they have clear motivations, but they're there as a foil, so they're not really there to grow or change. And I think Sanchez does, and I thought that was a really interesting addition to expand on the villain and his relationships with other people.
Now, you've also read in between the lines that there's a possible homoerotic relationship between Sanchez and Bond?
I have suggested that possibly there is, something maybe. I mean, it's weird how he treats Bond. He takes him to his house, he puts him up, he serves him tea, and he plays mother and pours the tea out, and it's like, that's just, why is he doing that? And I think he looks quite affectionate. Now, I am drawing that to its furthest conclusion, and I'm happy for people to go, nah, because I understand that. But also, his relationship with Dario is very affectionate. He's got this, handsome young boy he likes to keep around and stuff. But if you go back to the novels, there is often something a little bit kinky about the Bond villains, third nipples, whatever. And I think Sanchez bears quite relation to Scaramanga in the novel Man with the Golden Gun, and I think that novel quite heavily implies some sort of attraction. Although I know it was an unfinished work, and that Fleming basically had died before it had been fully edited. So I think it's drawing from that, and it's an interesting idea. And of course, then you watch Skyfall, and they're not subtle about it in that one.
Not at all.
Was that too much?
I saw that as being added because it could be added. There's no other moments in the rest of the film where Silver uses his sexuality for or against anyone else. There's no other moments where it's, you know, a consideration. So I don't really know why they included it.
Yeah. No, it's one of those things where, but then I have this a lot with Skyfall, is I don't know why that's there. I don't know what that functions.
It got a cheap laugh.
Yeah, actually made, it's one of the few times in the cinema where I actually started to think, oh, well, at least somebody's having some fun here, because everybody else is bloody miserable for the 2.5 hours. At least you're having some fun.
Imagine then if it's 1986, Pierce Brosnan manages to get out of his contract with Remington Steele and he gets cast as Bond, and we get The Living Daylights, which John Glenn has said would have been in a similar vein to the way it is now had Pierce Brosnan done it. What do you think would have come next? Would he have had a License to Kill?
No, I think it would have been really different. It's funny, I've looked back at those promo pictures when they were getting Brosnan ready. He looks so young. He looks way too young. I think they would have kept the humour in Living Daylights. I think Brosnan would have quite happily sat on a flying carpet, and I think they would have kept that. I think it would have stayed lighter, and I think it would have been less serious, and I think it would have been probably a safer film, because, you know, Dalton's portrayal lent itself to going down the License to Kill avenue. I think Brosnan as an actor can do it, but I'm not sure his Bond and how young he was would have got there. So my temptation is we would have got something closer to the later Roger Moore's than something so very different.
Would the films have continued, do you think, in that vein? Obviously, there was legal issues as to...
Yeah, I mean, another thing actually about the book is just to put to death the idea that the Bond films nearly died because of Timothy Dalton. They nearly died because a guy called Giancarlo Peretti bought MGM, I think, and it's very complicated. But basically, legal rights tied up the Bond films for years, and it made a right mess of things. They were ready to make a third one with Dalton. They had, you know, the basic ideas, and you can find those on the internet. They're quite interesting. It would have been a slightly less grounded version, because it would have, I think it was going to involve robotics in Hong Kong and all sorts of things. So that would have been an interesting sort of movie. No, I think those were financial issues. Look, if Brosnan had done it and it had made, you know, $100 million more, those legal issues probably would have been easier to sort more quickly.
Yeah,
because, you know, that's the way of Hollywood. But I think we would have had the same problem. And then, you know, where would we be now? Because obviously Brosnan was phenomenally successful.
You also mentioned that License to Kill may have been harmed slightly by the publicity and the way that it had to change its title halfway through. If you were going to remarket License to Kill, then what would you have called it?
I think License Revoked was fine. I think License Revoked was fine. I think License to Kill... there was already a movie out. I don't mention that in the book, but it stars Denzel Washington, a small movie. Yeah. But, you know, it's not good. I think what you've got to do is, whatever your title, you've got to communicate it confidently. And there's a little rule, I think, in the Hollywood, in the trade presses, is that if a movie starts changing its title, everybody thinks it's in trouble, whether that's true or not. Because it suggests to you that the producers are not confident in the film that they've made. So whatever your title, just be confident about it and go for it. I think License Revoked is a fine title. I think License to Kill is a reasonable title. A bit generic-y, maybe.
Do you remember Sanchez's rule, his law?
Oh, Lead or Silver.
Yeah.
That would have been great.
Would that have worked?
Yeah, I would have been happy with that. It makes sense. I wouldn't like to write the song.
So what are your hopes then for the Bond future?
I am aware that I am now about to hit 40, and possibly I'm not the core audience for these movies anymore, and that's okay. So the movies I love still exist. I just go and watch them. I will keep watching the new ones, I expect. But I think at the minute my expectations have been dulled. I think both Spectre and Skyfall dulled my expectations. I didn't like them.
If you had to cast the next Bond actor, who would you have?
Well, look, I'm a big fan of Tom Hardy. I know he gets mentioned a lot. And if it was a Chris Nolan movie, I could imagine Tom Hardy would do it. Another Tom who I was against until I saw a film called High Rise is Tom Hiddleston.
Uh-huh.
He plays Loki, of course, but a lot of people think he's a bit lightweight. But in the film High Rise, which is by a British director called Ben Wheatley, who's a very interesting director, Tom Hiddleston comes across really well. He wears a suit really well. He's charming. He's kind of got a sort of sexiness to him that I thought, actually, I can see that. I can visualise it now. I don't know, who do you think?
We've mentioned, Tom and Chris on James Bond Radio have mentioned numerous times about the wolfishness of Dalton.
Yeah.
How he has that look in his eye. Yeah. A current media darling is an actor from Poldark.
Right, yes, I've not watched Poldark. Well,
Aidan Turner is an awesome figure of a man, if I may say that. He's got that wolfish look. And if you were going to do the way they did Superman Returns with Brandon Routh, and they were sort of pretending that it was still Christopher Reeve, because he looks a bit like him, and it's set in the same universe, and it's like a direct sequel. If you were going to do Living Daylights 2, you could do a lot worse than getting Aidan Turner involved.
I mean, I know, because obviously people do these lists constantly, and I've noticed it, but I, to be fair, never watched him. I think you've got to trust in the producers. I guess they know what they're doing, and panicking about the fact that they had a director for a year making a movie, and then, he quit over whatever reason. That's got to be a whole book in itself at some point, hasn't it? Is why Danny Boyle up sticks and left, and it sounds fascinating. Yeah. I don't know. Do you go with somebody similar to Daniel Craig, or do you go completely differently?
I guess going by that, you'd need someone who looked very different to Daniel Craig and was going for a slightly more light-hearted tone.
Maybe I would like. It's going to sound like a really odd thing, but I think I would like him to look like he spent less time in a gym.
Okay.
I think if you go back to the novels, Bond is athletic. He's not huge. But I'm not sure that accords to somebody who's supposed to drink a lot and really enjoy fine food and, all those sorts of things. And I think the cinema is overstuffed with muscle-bound superheroes. And I think it'd be quite nice if James Bond went back to something that was a bit more elegant. Let's use the word elegant. Okay. And I think we've lost some elegance.
Would you tell Daniel Craig to his face that he wasn't elegant?
Absolutely. I would say your portrayal of James Bond lacks the level of elegance I personally require. So please change everything you do just for me.
If people are interested in reading your book, where can they find it?
It's available on Amazon. You can get it in good old-fashioned paper, or you can have it as a digital download. And it's just on there. So just go on there and find it. It's titled "He Disagreed with Something That Ate Him," which, as you all know, is a line from License to Kill, although it's stolen from the novel Live and Let Die. But I saw it as a metaphor for Dalton's whole approach to fame. And it's an interesting distinction between Dalton and the other actors. Dalton is an actor first and a film star second. I think he's a person who is much happier. When you read interviews, he's much happier on the stage. He likes to research a character, get into great depth in the character, and I think he did that with Bond. He's not necessarily the greatest person to have on a talk show, perhaps. He's not got that sort of persona. Pierce Brosnan, and this is not denigrating his acting ability, is a great guy for the chat circuit. He's really good at those things, and he was really good at the publicity. And the title occurred to me when I was reading a fairly recent interview with Dalton when he was asked why he didn't do any more. Because Cubby Broccoli was like, we're making a new Bond film, we want you to do it. Okay, maybe some other people don't, but Broccoli did, because they wanted that recognition. And Dalton, would have done one more, but he would have had to sign up for 3 or 4, movies, sign that contract. And he was just like, it's too much. And that sort of metaphor that was the fame sort of ate him up. He didn't enjoy that. I think he's liked the fact that he did James Bond. I never get the sense that he liked necessarily being James Bond and doing the press and doing the job. He's an actor. He wants to turn up, he wants to act, and he wants to go home. And being a movie star is a slightly different thing. And as something I mentioned towards the end of the book is actually he's more the sort of actor you would cast as a bad guy, which Hollywood did in The Rocketeer, and he's really good in that. He's a well-trained, really good British stage actor. That is, Alan Rickman. That's the bad guy, Joss Ackland in Lethal Weapon 2. It's not necessarily the sort of superheroic guy. So he's, in many respects, an odd choice for Bond. And yeah, that's sort of what occurred to me, and that's why we titled it that. So you can either search my name, Cary Edwards. I think it's possibly under Cary Edwards PhD, because some other bugger had a similar name. Or if you just put in, he disagreed with something that ate him into the search bar, it will come straight up.
What have you got plans for the future then with regards to writing? Is there something else in the pipeline?
I've just submitted a paper to a journal which is much more heavily academic on folk horror, which is a growing thing. Folk horror, for those who don't know, is based on movies like The Wicker Man, the original Wicker Man, not the hilarious Nicolas Cage remake. But films that are really engaged with sort of British folklore and that stuff. And there's a very obscure Welsh folk horror called Darklands from 1996. Okay. And so I've written about that in all sorts of ways. I've got my PhD thesis, which is 87,000 words to look at, and what I'm going to do with that, because that's just sat there. And I've got to think about, okay, is that something that's worth pursuing? We're coming up to at the anniversary of the movies that I wrote about in the PhD, so it seems like a good thing. But that's quite a long project. In the meantime, I've written for a couple of online journals, Horror, Homeroom, and Bright Lights Films. So whatever occurs to me when I see something will probably just get scribbled down, and I'll send it to them, and they'll either publish it or laugh at me, whichever happens first.
Okay. And have you had any feedback with regards to this?
Just little bits, yeah. People, like, if anybody wants to leave a nice review on Amazon, please do. I mean, read it first, obviously. But yeah, I think, people have liked it that I've read it. But then it's all people I know who've read it so far, and that's always the risky thing. It's the friends and family market is a biased market.
Would there be any mileage, do you think, in sending a copy to Timothy Dalton's agent?
You know what? I've been toying with, Michael Wilson, Timothy Dalton, and I should. And I think I will do that. Let's do it.
It doesn't really do the films any disfavour, does it? It's celebrating them, and it's pointing out how good they are, and it's actually finding things that weren't necessarily there anyway and bringing that to the surface as well.
The risk with that is always that you get a note back saying you're a complete idiot. I didn't mean any of those things in my performance. You know nothing. But you know what? If I got that, I'd put it on the wall. So that's fine by me.
Well, I think it's a fascinating book, and I was very intrigued to see these films that I know and love in a different light.
Well, I hope you go back and, I know you're going to keep enjoying them because you love them, but it might just sort of shift how you think about them, and maybe the other movies, and just, that's what I hopefully do when I teach is I love movies, but I think let's open them up, let's think about them as much as we can, and enjoy them in different ways.
Well, look, Cary, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Cary for giving us so much of his time. If you're a fan of Tim Dalton's Bond films or film analysis in general, you should pick up a copy of his book, and I'm sure you'll find something to get your teeth into. I should point out that James Bond Radio is available to follow on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and probably Grindr by now. You can leave a review of the podcast on iTunes, which will help us rank higher in the search engines and attract more listeners. And you can also visit jamesbondradio.com, where you can get involved in the discussions, leave us a voicemail, or even press the donate button, which is always appreciated but never expected. Right, so, yes, I promised earlier I was going to burp the James Bond theme, didn't I? Since I made that promise, I've actually been handed a note saying it's just too dangerous. and I'm not covered by the insurance to do any stunts, so it's not going to happen. Although the small print does say I could play out using my armpits. That's just humiliating. Thank you for joining us. I've been Dan Gale, and James Bond Radio will return with proper hosts who don't lean on their squeaky desks when they're interviewing people.